Richard Spruce immediately, through the metaphor of botany, slipped right into their world. So he was the very first to identify ayahuasca, the other great hallucinogen, yopo. He was the first to see Amazonian coca made. He was the first to get seeds of cinchona, the source of quinine, the only treatment then available for malaria. He also, years before Wickham's so-called theft of the rubber seeds from Brazil, Spruce had identified no fewer than 6 new species in the genus Hevea. Now, I think that the interesting thing about these men is that there is no naturalist alive today who works in the Amazon, man or woman, who does not invoke one of these characters as his or her sort of primordial influence. And it really doesn't have anything to do whether you're an entomologist, you don't necessarily like Bates, you might prefer Wallace, and you could be an ethnographer and prefer Spruce, because you might, especially if, like me, you're into drugs. But the point is, these men represented not just the beginning of this kind of scholarship that we engage in reflexively today, the fact that we don't have to be aristocrats. You know, we don't have to be humble. We can be ordinary people, cobble together a little bit of money, and you can go out and change the history of science. And this bond between these 3 individuals and all naturalists who came later is almost a sacred connection. And that's really the connection I'd like to talk about with you today, because of course the student, as any professor knows, is as important as a teacher in the lineage of knowledge. And of all connections that grew out of this trio of extraordinary explorers and naturalists, there is one that surpasses all, because this is the only case where, in fact, the protege surpassed the achievements of the mentor. And the man in question, of course, is Richard Evans Schultes. He was to the 20th century what Spruce was to the 19th. I first knew him as a legend on the Harvard campus, a kindly professor who shot blowguns in class and kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available to his students as an optional laboratory experiment. In 1941, having solved the problem of Tehuacanacoatl, having discovered the magic mushrooms and sparked the psychedelic era, he slipped away into the northwest Amazon in 1941, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the neotropical rainforest. If Richard Spruce in 17 years would collect 20,000 plants, Schultes in 12 would collect 30,000, including 2,000 medicinal plants previously unknown to science, and no fewer than 300 new species of vascular plants. But Schultes was an odd choice to become a 60s icon because his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. In fact, the only way a colleague said of Schultes that he could go native would be to go to London. Now, to understand the link between Schultes and Richard Spruce, you literally have to accept the possibility that the seed of one generation can be born in the next, and that the spirit of one long dead can reach across time not merely to inspire, but to mold the dreams of another. Late in life, Schultes was asked by a journalist whether it was not possible that he had consciously or even subconsciously modeled his life on that of Richard Spruce. And in an odd sense, they first met 20 years, 30 years after Spruce had died in 1922 in a hospital room in Boston when 7-year-old Richard Evans Schultes lay dying with a childhood fever. By complete chance, his father, who was a simple man, a plumber, had plucked out of the local library 2 volumes. The title of that were Notes of a Botanist on the Amazon and Andes, being the records of travel on the Amazon and its tributaries during the years 1849 to 1864. These 2 well-worn journals were, of course, Spruce's journal entries and letters, which had been edited together after his death by no other than Alfred Wallace. Now, Schultes obviously was not conscious of this kind of atavistic moment, but you would have thought perhaps that he was, given what unfolded. Some years later, he found himself the first of his family to go to university. He was so poor that they couldn't attend the dorms at Harvard, and he took a job filing cards in what turned out for him to be a world of wonder, the most eclectic library in North America, the Economic Botany Library at Harvard's Botanical Museum. And in between the folios of Brunfels and the monographs of distant tribes and the accounts of strange plants that were then known as the Fantastica, Schultes fell away into trance. And he took a course that had been taught at Harvard longer than any other in the history of the university, Plants and Human Affairs. And the iconoclastic professor, Oakes Ames, who hated the federal government and had insisted throughout all of Prohibition that his students brew and distill and ferment copious amounts of booze as a laboratory experiment, had his limits when it came time to these plants that we now call the hallucinogens. And so the students had to do a book report, and Schultes had so much other homework that he rushed to the back of the room, plucked from the shelf the thinnest volume he could find, put it in his satchel, and returned to his tenement in East Boston. And that night, when he drew that volume out of his book bag, history was made. Because that book turned out to be the only monograph then available in the English language that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote, of mescaline. And throughout the night, this very conservative lad from East Boston read of visions of orb-like brilliance that descended from the heavens over the consciousness of the consumer. He went back to Professor Ames the next day and he said, "I must know this plant." And Ames said, "You can study it for your thesis. I might even be able to get you a grant." Of course, the grant came from Professor Ames' own pocket. And that's how Schultes began to study peyote.